Hello, I'm Lesley Riddoch. I'm a national columnist, I'm an independent supporter, and I'm a journalist. And I'm very chuffed to be interviewing the three leaders of the pro-independence parties in the run-up to the general election. The idea is to ask the kind of questions yesers really might want to be asking to decide which of these parties they would want to vote for. I'm trying not to ask patsy questions, a habit of a lifetime. So I hope all our leaders will not take it personally. There are also some readers' questions fed into this, but that's not exclusively the way that things will go. There's half an hour, so I'm going to crack on. Delighted, actually, that our first leader today will be Alex Salmond, the leader of Alba. Hello, Alex.
Hello. Good morning.
Hello. Now, just to get straight to the beef of it, I suppose, it just looks like Labour are going to win this general election. What will that mean for Scotland?
Well, in policy terms, virtually no change. I mean, the Labour's macroeconomic approach is, in fact, it's probably more conservative than the Tories, and their spending commitments are very, very limited. In terms of attitude to the Scottish Parliament, I think it'd be a mistake to think it's going to be less aggressive than the Tory. It might be in different ways. I mean, to give you but one example, I picked up in the Labour manifesto their enthusiasm for new nuclear power in Scotland. Well, you could only have new nuclear power if you were prepared to override the planning issues in the Scottish Parliament. So that would just be one example. They may pick different battles, but I think the general tendency will be for Westminster to encroach on the Scottish Parliament powers. And I think Labour will probably regard that as to their advantage in the run-up to the Scottish election in 2 years' time.
Now, independence has really dominated all the questions sent in. No surprise, it's an interview for The National. So you say that you have a special independence strategy. At the time of recording this, we haven't had your manifesto launched yet. So what is the big offer?
Can I just say a word about the manifesto launch? The reason that we haven't had the manifesto launch is that we have to wait till all the other parties have launched their manifestos. Otherwise, we won't get coverage. I mean, it's just one example of how television dictate the election against the interests of smaller parties, but probably against the interests of Scotland as well. So we tried, for example, to have launched, today is Monday, right? We'd launched today in competition to the second launch of a Tory manifesto. This is a Rishi Sunak launching the Scottish manifesto. We'd had no coverage whatsoever. So we'll be launching on Wednesday, and that will spell out the Alba approach to independence, which hopefully is becoming better known through this campaign, and that is to say we regard each and every election as potentially looking for an independence mandate, and we'd see that we are introducing this argument in this election, and we think the Scottish elections in 2 years' time and the regional poll in these elections are actually the ideal election test to see if there is majority popular support for independence. And that's what the political parties should aim for, and they should take that as the mandate, not to seek a referendum, which is not going to be granted or given, thanks to the missed opportunities of the last 10 years, but to seek a direct electoral mandate at an election for Scottish independence, and then the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament will have the job of bending Westminster to the will of the Scottish people and accepting that mandate.
Just as a matter of interest, would you say that, let's say, de facto referendum within an election, should that be a majority of seats or votes?
It has to be a majority of votes. There's no doubt about that. And that's because you're replacing a mandate from a referendum because a referendum is no longer available to you. You're replacing it with an election, but therefore you have to have a popular mandate in terms of votes. That's why I actually think that the second vote, the regional vote, in the Scottish elections is the ideal electoral test for it. Why? Because the regional vote doesn't have the tactical vote considerations which bedevil constituency polling. You know, people saying, well, don't vote for me, just vote against that guy or that woman. You don't like, you may not like me very much, but you like them less, etc., etc., etc. Don't vote for such and such a party because it's got no chance of winning. The list vote in the Scottish elections is actually the ideal vote for an electoral test on independence, but you'd have to look at a majority of the votes cast.
You've actually mentioned the Holyrood elections now 4 times, Alex. I mean, you're not standing yourself for the general election. And some folk might say, if the general's not leading, his party into battle, does it really matter? And the thing is, it won't matter for you, because I don't know if you can accept you're not likely to win a seat, but you might mean that the SNP don't.
Well, we've got more chance, for example, than the Green Party of winning a seat in this election. But it's certainly true that our focus has always been in the next Holyrood elections. But you cannot just introduce a political argument to people at the election in which you're contesting. And therefore, this election is our opportunity to introduce the political argument about how you obtain a route forward to independence. And for any independence supporter in Scotland, there's nothing more important. But I mean, to wait till the next Scottish election campaign and say, right, we've got a great idea, we want to marshal support for, I think would be unwise. Political parties have to be prepared if they're serious political parties. We now in this election will have a cadre of candidates who, going through the experience of an election campaign, will be well suited to be candidates in the Scottish elections. We'll learn things in terms of campaigning that there's no amount of political theory will teach you. It's only political practice in an election campaign. And every vote, of course, at this election will count towards independence, because unambiguously, every vote for Alba is a register of vote for Scottish independence.
Yes, but I mean, this is basically then you're saying a rehearsal for you for the important election. But if an Alba or I suppose a Green candidate standing in a seat they're not going to win means the SNP end up losing the Scottish election to Labour, with all the kind of negativity that will attract from the mainstream media, from unionists, will you not feel a bit guilty about that?
Yes, I was interested. You said, and I suppose agreed. I mean, exactly the same argument could be applied to the Greens. In Alba's case, certainly, I don't think the argument's valid. We have a situation we've had for some months now, where we've got 50% of people supporting Scottish independence, and around 30%, maybe just over 30%, say they're going to vote SNP in a general election. That means 20% of independence supporting Scots are intending either to stay at home or probably in some cases, to vote for a unionist party at this coming election. You have to work out why that is. I think it's disillusionment, disaffection, frustration with the lack of progress to independence. And Alba's explicit target this election is that 20% of the vote, the people who otherwise are going to be demotivated and stay at home, in the same way it's happened, incidentally, in the 2017 election. And why the SNP haven't learned the lesson from 2017 as to what happens when you demotivate the independence vote, I've got no idea. But from Alba's point of view, we're not splitting the vote, we're mobilising the independence vote.
Okay, but 2017 was a Scottish election with, as you say, a proportional element. This is a...
No. 2017, I beg your pardon, was a general election. 2017 was a general election. It was a UK general election, where the SNP went back from 56 seats to 30 something or other.
Apologies.
And it will happen, Lesley, and it's really important to understand it. I mean, I fought that election. I lost that election. First election I've ever lost in my life. And therefore, I know exactly why that election was lost. It wasn't lost because there was dramatic enthusiasm with other parties. It wasn't lost because people stopped supporting independence. It was lost because people didn't believe that the SNP in that election were arguing for an independence platform. And there would be a great deal of reason to have scepticism in this election as to whether independence is the key point of the SNP's thrust in this election. It's the key point when they send out letters to people asking for money. In these letters, it's mentioned 7 times in 4 paragraphs. But I just got, because the SNP records are notoriously bad, I just got my supporters letter from the SNP yesterday with John Swinney in the front. John Swinney's there asking me to vote for a stronger Scotland is there, and this, that, and the next thing. The one word that's missing from that leaflet sent out presumably to every supporter around Scotland, the one thing it's missing is the word independence.
But is Alba's real push now? I mean, let's just look at where the SNP is on other policies. They seem to have rolled back on a lot of their Green stuff. They don't seem to be seeking to have the Gender Recognition Reform Act reinstated. Some of the key policies that probably characterised Alba seem to have now moved with the SNP. So haven't they stolen your clothes a bit?
Well, well, certainly if you say rowed back. I don't see any sign that the SNP are as interested as they should be in protecting the rights of women and girls. Certainly, there's been no explicit statement to that effect. There's certainly been no explicit statement that they'll seek to rescind the Gender Reform Act and self-identification, which has so poisoned Scottish politics over the last few years. But I mean, there's other arguments about the Scottish National Party which we find very distressing at the present moment. I mean, you've got two choices effectively as a national party and a dominant governing party in Scotland. You can either fight an election on the cause of independence, which is what the SNP should have done, or if you don't fight it on that, you end up fighting it on your political record, which most people for the SNP in governance over the last few years, most people would find it short of the mark and certainly not something which would inspire people to go to the barricades on. Therefore, they should have fought this election on independence. They're not doing that, and that's much to be regretted. Of course, if we remember the history of this, last year, repeatedly, Alba offered the SNP the suggestion that there should be one independence candidate in each constituency. We were only asking for the two Alba MPs, excuse me, to be the independence candidates in their constituencies, and Angus MacNeil to be the independent candidate for independence in the Western Isles. That wasn't a big ask, but the SNP repeatedly refused it. Now, at some point as a political party, you've got to take no for an answer, and we took no for an answer from the SNP and are therefore advertising a distinctive policy, which was for a short time the SNP's policy, of course, and that is to see a national election as giving the mandate to pursue independence. Now, there's nothing more important for anybody interested in Scottish independence and working out a political strategy to get there. I mean, the SNP had been in existence for more than half a century when they had the audacity to elect me as leader. And the one thing I managed to give the SNP over the period of leadership was a strategy to get to Scottish independence and also an ability to replace the Labour Party as the dominant force in Scottish politics. It took 25 years. You cannot believe the amount of anguish that I feel and that others in that position who were with me over these 25 years feel effectively leadership being handed back to the Labour Party with apparently no effort whatsoever.
But let me come back on this strategy, because if you were to try to move forward on not having a referendum, don't you have the problem then that international recognition seems fairly contingent upon having a referendum? I mean, the Spanish, for example, have said they won't apply a veto to EU membership should there be a lawful referendum in Scotland. You can imagine the converse is also true.
Well, you might be able to imagine that, but I mean, the Spanish position is one of acceptance, not one of referendum. I mean, for understandable reasons, the Spanish are not particularly keen on referendum within state. But what they say is the state has to accept the position on independence. That's the Spanish formal position. And since I extracted it some time ago from the then Spanish foreign minister, I probably know exactly what it is. But I mean, that's the point, Lesley. You'll have to get acceptance in some way or other. The question is how you get that acceptance. We are not going to get a referendum anytime soon, anytime within the foreseeable future. Therefore, there has to be another electoral test. Once you have that electoral test and you take your mandate, then it's your job to enforce the mandate. You've got then to persuade Westminster to bow to the will of the Scottish people. And you have to also canvass the international community for recognition. I mean, I can go through the states you like, which have become independent without referendum, but I suppose the most relevant one, if we take aside some other factors from it, in these islands would be Ireland. There was no referendum on independence in Ireland to establish the Irish Free State. It was done because of the comprehensive, resounding victory of Sinn Féin in the 1918 election and the various other aspects.
Okay, a lot of people would not want to see any kind of reference to Ireland within its independence.
Well, I know, but then, I mean, that hang-up.
You and I had a long conversation a long time ago about the Arc of Prosperity. So let's look at Norway.
Let's look at things then.
But just a minute, they did have referendums. All the modern states from recent times, Estonia, I've done films about them all.
How about the Czech Republic and Slovakia, for example? They're two independent states who didn't have a referendum. They had an election which they voted in different directions and came to an agreement, the velvet divorce, if you may remember. Look,
and
listen,
it was an agreement.
if it was given,
people worry
if
that
it was
there will
given
never
to
be an
you,
agreement. If you've got a state like Britain that won't even allow you to have the Section 30 powers to hold a referendum, a lot of people will feel it will never recognise anything short of that. Because, I mean, why should it?
That's a counsel of despair, Lesley. If you believe that, right, then you believe you'll never get a referendum granted. Therefore, there is no point in you and I pursuing the independence cause, if that's your position. My position is Westminster is nothing like as tough or as strong or as big or as brave or as bold as some people in Scotland seem to think it is. And Westminster can be faced down, as I faced it down before, admittedly through getting a referendum. But you have to ask yourself, why did Cameron grant, quote, a referendum back in 2014 in the 2012 Edinburgh Agreement? Yes, of course, he was arrogant and insouciant enough to believe he was going to win it. That's true. But also, I made it clear to him through various means that if he didn't have the Section 30, then we would hold our own referendum using the powers within the Parliament's competence, taking the obvious sensible precautions that any First Minister you would believe would take who was making that move. And I don't want to make the reference any more explicit than that, Lesley, but you'll understand exactly why.
Well, I don't actually.
Okay, because there's a rule in politics which applies even after you're First Minister. You mustn't divulge either the existence or the content of law officers' advice. But I would think in principle,
Court's advice.
Well, I think in principle and in theory, but certainly in practice, you'd be very foolish First Minister indeed not to ensure that advice on any such matters was obtained before you pursued a certain course of action.
So you're saying it was different from the Supreme Court's verdict?
No, I'm saying you asked a different question, Lesley. Let me try again. In terms of facing down Cameron, it was important to believe if he said no, I'm not interested in the majority.
That. You're saying that there could have been a fallback referendum.
Well, I was trying to answer your question, Lesley. In terms of facing down Cameron, it was important to have something in the locker just in case he said no back in 2012. One of the things I had in the locker was our own referendum, not a referendum straight on, do you want Scotland to be an independent country, but a referendum within the powers and competence in the Parliament, because I realised, and he realised, and was very frightened of it, that any independent action on the Constitution by the Scottish Parliament and government was something deeply threatening to the British state. And he also thought I was going to frame a referendum in a way which was likely to be won. Now, that was then. The point I'm making is the British state can be taken on democratically and overcome. But if you go in with an attitude that, well, the big boys and girls in Westminster are never going to grant us anything, you might as well give up and stay in your house instead of going out to vote.
Okay, let's look at Alba's current polling. It's looking like the last poll I saw was it 5 or 6%? I mean, that's actually less in that particular poll than Reform, which is kind of depressing. It also looks like you slid in the polls since Nicola Sturgeon's resignation, to be honest. And it looks as if your strategy of going for the list really depends on the SNP actually winning first past the post bit of the Scottish elections. So are you not sort of a bit umbilically tied to them in terms of your strategy and your success in a Scottish Parliament election?
Well, our last poll it was actually our best ever poll. The 5-6%, that's the best poll that Alba have ever had. That's the Northstat poll from last week at this time. Why is that? Incidentally, I think that's because of the campaign that's happening in the seats where Alba is standing, where we're not getting on television, hardly at all, but we're certainly making our presence felt in the streets and in these campaigns. So people know in these seats we're standing, and that's attracting support. But I mean, obviously, as you're well aware, 5 or 6% is particularly significant because that is the trigger level at which you gain seats in the Scottish Parliament. And 5% would probably get you 3 seats, 6% will get you 8 seats, and we know how it grows from then. Once you get to 15%, which is Alba's.
You had a projection of 20 seats in 2022. That's quite a kind of change, isn't it?
Well, what I was going to say is once you get to 15%, which is Alba's explicit target for the list vote in 2 years' time, then you get 24 seats, give or take a seat or two depending how the calculations work out in the list. Now, if we got 24 seats, for example, and let's say to take your suggestion that the SNP go down from 64 seats where they are now to around 40 seats, if you add 40 and 24, then you're very near or have a majority in the Scottish Parliament. That actually, I think, is the only way, incidentally, there's going to be a nationalist majority in the next Scottish Parliament. That's the only conceivable way I can see that happening. And I'm talking here about people who actually believe in independence, who think it's a red line, who think it's something worth pursuing, as opposed to people that play about it to get into office occasionally.
Okay. Let me ask you about energy. There's been a recent court case, Supreme Court again, ruling that a drilling operation in Surrey is basically unlawful and cannot go ahead. There's 3 cases, I think, that Greenpeace is ready to take, waiting for that judgment, and they're all along similar lines. The judgment suggests that you have to weigh up the use, the climate destroying use of any oil or gas that's extracted, not just the process of extraction. Does that not knock Rosebank, all of the rest of the big projects on the head, and indeed your own support for oil and gas?
Well, it would, unless you had a credible campaign for carbon abatement attached to each field. I mean, Alba's policy is that licence conditions should only be granted with an explicit licence condition of investment in carbon capture. That, I think, we argue that is perfectly feasible to do. It's something that oil companies will only do if they're made to do it.
Yeah,
as you remember,
they're doing it in Norway at the moment, Alex. What I'm asking is,
enough, is it? I've been, it was my business before I came into politics. I know just a marginal amount about it. I've been pursuing and crusading on the cause of carbon capture since the early 2000s, since before it was sabotaged by Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling.
That judgment says it's not enough to look at the means of extraction. It's the entire life cycle of the oil and gas you're taking out. That's different.
But I mean, look, if it is feasible at industrial and scale to re-inject carbon dioxide into the North Sea aquifers and saline aquifers and oil fields in the North Sea with appropriate geology, if that can be done, then that will do more, potentially, to reduce the carbon dioxide output of the continent of Europe than any other single measure.
Right.
Now,
but
if somebody can't argue that successfully before the Supreme Court or anywhere else, then there won't be much of an advocate, particularly if they've got legislative power behind them.
Who could argue about it would be the Institute for Energy Economics.
But then, Lesley,
Albert, let me have a wee shot that carbon capture is not a climate solution. They've looked at the 55% of the world's current operational capacity in carbon capture and found that 7 underperformed, 2 failed, and 1 was mothballed.
Yeah, but none are in the saline aquifers of the North Sea. And of course, as you're well aware, since you mentioned Norway, Sleipner is actually the best performing carbon capture, although it wasn't designed as a carbon capture enterprise originally.
But the main
carbon capture,
this keeps oil gushing, doesn't it?
It would be interesting to find out, would it not? The reason I think carbon capture will work in the North Sea is because for various other reasons, principally oil-enhanced recovery, carbon dioxide has been injected into various North Sea geological formulations over the last 50 years, and there's been no record of it escaping whatsoever. So if it's going to work anywhere in the world, it'll work in the geology of the North Sea. But wouldn't it be interesting to find that out? As opposed to removing tens of thousands of jobs. I mean, listen, if I'd had policy direction over this, we'd already know the answer. We'd know the answer from the Miller project of 2005 and 2007. But we're entitled surely to put this forward as a proposition.
I know, and I'm entitled to ask a question, Alex. Remember, I'm asking a question. 73% of the carbon has been re-injected, as you say, into oil fields to push more oil out of the ground. Now, that basically means more oil. So carbon capture is mostly, at the moment, helping to produce more oil and gas.
Which is why we argue that the methane should be taken and split its source into hydrogen gas and to carbon dioxide. That is, the methane is hydrogen and carbon dioxide. You take the hydrogen as a clean burn fuel, hopefully we agree on that, and you take the methane and put it back into the North Sea. That is the proposition that we put forward. Can I just remind you, when I left office as First Minister, Scotland was 4% ahead of our greenhouse targets 6 years early. We were at 46% from 1990, which was our target for 2020, was 42%. So we were 4% ahead 6 years early because of the dramatic move that I sanctioned to onshore wind generation. Now, if you are serious about wanting to meet carbon targets, then you should do two other big moves. The first move is the one we've been discussing. You don't agree with it. I do. I think there's plenty of evidence on my side, but no doubt you think the reverse. But the second move is the move to hydrogen. I'm old enough, you're probably not old enough, but you may be, to remember the move from from town gas to natural gas in the 1960s. Within about a 6-year period, the entire heating network of the UK was transformed from one form of gas to another. Why can't that be done once hydrogen is flowing in production, which of course is partly about the carbon capture initiatives I'm suggesting?
Because that's blue hydrogen. That's what people are worried about, is that everything that you can cite that's an outcome of the oil and gas industry depends on oil and gas continuing.
Well, the hydrogen is a clean burn fuel, Lesley. I mean, unless you're now suggesting that hydrogen
gas
shouldn't be used.
continuing. That's and listen, these are not my views. I'm simply putting the counter argument.
I'm just speaking as the First Minister who was ahead of his greenhouse emission targets.
Okay, so let me ask you about that.
Well, I mean, I just want to finish just one sentence. Who was ahead of his greenhouse emission targets, who put forward the Climate Change Act and got unanimous parliamentary agreement for it in 2009, when it was then a genuine world-leading thing. All I'm saying is I've got a modicum of credibility, not just of talking about it, Lesley, but actually doing it. And, that's a proposition we'll put to the people. They'll judge if it's credible or not.
Okay. Is Scotland currently inviting foreign corporations to basically exploit our renewables for their benefit?
Yes.
And so what would you do about it?
Well, I think there should be I don't want to preview a manifesto, but we're going to have a real public energy company called Saltire Energy, which we'll be proposing, which will have an automatic 20% share in every deep offshore wind field. And given in deep offshore wind, probably best exploited by floating turbines, we have enough capacity within the foreseeable future to generate 10 times Scotland's electricity requirements. I mean, that is the major aspect of energy going forward. Why are we saying a 20% public share? Because we're mimicking what Norway did a long time ago with oil and gas. I mean, to me, you don't have a crystal ball to know how to handle a major energy resource. You just need to read the Norwegian book, in my opinion. The 20% gets you not just a huge public endowment and a huge, powerful company which can make relevant interventions in the marketplace, but it also gets you the knowledge of each individual project, so you actually know what the finances are, and when these nefarious international energy companies, some of them publicly owned, many of them privately owned, are telling you the truth, and when they're not.
Right. Well, we will wait for the manifesto with bated breath. A few quick fire questions that I'll be putting to everyone just to close, Alex. You had a bit of
It was a penalty.
Yeah, you could have guessed it was going there. And you're lucky John McGinn, number 7, Scotland unbeaten shirt didn't help. But do you think
I think Bryce Haley's put something on it?
Did Scotland's defeat in the Euros, will that affect this election?
Probably at the margins, yeah. I think national mood is very important, and for independence, obviously, I do think that's important because I tried to arrange the date of the referendum back in 2014, where I felt the national mood would be one of optimism. The Commonwealth Games and so on and so forth were part of that calculation. So obviously, I do think national mood is quite important. But national mood can be encouraged in a whole sort of ways. And the most important thing about national mood is for people to believe they've got politicians in the government who are trying to serve the public and do a job for Scotland. That's the most important thing.
Right. At the Portillo moment, The Guardian suggests that a third of the big beasts, the Tory big beasts, won't be standing again anyway, which deprives us of the of the moment of watching them quit the stage. Who will you be sitting waiting to be seen defeated on a podium on July the 4th?
There's one or two politicians I dislike. In terms of their politics, not personally, but I don't really go in for that very much. I do hope that some people save their seats. As people know, I've got a great friend, David Davis, who, it's what a Tory MP should be. I believe in human rights and things like that. The unfashionable causes these days. But I like people who are prepared to pursue unfashionable causes, and I hope that some of them survive. But it won't do me any distress to see the Tory party reduced to 50 seats. That'd be great, actually. And maybe even David could become Prime Minister or a leader of the opposition in these circumstances, so there'd be nobody else left.
Look, I appreciate you've got a friendship there, but that will not probably sit well with a lot of independent supporters.
No, I don't. Look, if people can't reconcile their belief in Scottish independence with admiration for people across the political spectrum who've done things, achieved things, had something to say, then I think they've got the wrong idea about Scottish independence. Scottish independence is a noble cause. It's something you pursue because you believe in it absolute for the betterment of the Scottish people. You don't do it so as you can dance on the graves of Unionists. The person, I suppose, I'd most like to see fail to win his seat, if you want me to be absolutely brutal about it, is Dick Dastardly, a.k.a. Douglas Ross. Because in my lifetime in politics, I've seen many dirty deeds, some horrendous things, but right up there is effectively cutting off the life support, metaphorically at least, of David Duckett. I've actually never seen someone stab a colleague in the back when they're in intensive care. That is the ultimate in sinister behaviour. So if the referee gets shown the red card, as I think he will be, incidentally, in this constituency, then I'll be quietly pleased. I may not punch the air as I would if that penalty had been granted, but nonetheless, I'll be quite pleased.
And final question: what is your biggest political mistake?
Resigning.
Right.
That was a mistake. I thought things were well set for the future. I didn't actually think independence could fail in a 10, 15-year project. I thought the people who were going to carry it forward were in it because they believed in independence. And I didn't realise that, I think as the SNP became more successful, then it managed to acquire a whole range of people who, I'm not saying they wouldn't quite like independence if it happened to pop along, but certainly weren't prepared to sacrifice anything to get it. And that was probably my mistake. And one which, see, the point is, Lesley, when I grew up in the SNP, right, and I had fearsome arguments, as you might remember, with people like Gordon Wilson. I disagreed. I was his deputy leader, and I disagreed with Gordon on strategy, just about everything, basically. But I never doubted for a minute that Gordon Wilson was wholeheartedly committed to Scottish independence. And I never doubted for a minute that Gordon Wilson would have sacrificed anything to achieve Scottish independence. We just disagreed on how to get there. I'm afraid that I look at the leadership, and certainly the MSPs and a range of the MPs of the Scottish National Party now, and I don't think the independence rate's very high in their list of personal priorities. Let's put it that way.
That should have been the last question, but that is so intriguing. Let me just ask you just a wee supplementary. You did encourage Nicola Sturgeon pretty much. I'm not saying you took her under your wing, but she lost. She looked like she was going to lose that first leadership election. You stepped back in and essentially helped her career progress. So if you're saying that she wasn't serious about independence, was that a bit of a mistake?
Well, I didn't mention Nicola's name. I just think that she. I didn't mention Nicola's name at all. But either I misjudged her or she changed. You'll have to decide which one it will be. If we're talking about Nicola, let's talk about Nicola politically. I cannot, and nobody's will ever tell me of a single scintilla of reason why a First Minister of Scotland who believed in independence would fling themselves at the mercy of the UK Supreme Court. Now, Nicola is an intelligent person.
And a lawyer.
Just as I can't imagine, I mean, when I appointed Lord Advocates, I appointed Lord Advocates because I thought they were fine, upstanding people. I thought they would pursue the law of Scotland diligently and separate the prosecution service from their advice to government. But obviously, there were certain questions I asked them. And one of the questions was about the competence of the Parliament as regards referendum and how they would approach it. I mean, how on earth can you get yourself into a position where, never mind the prosecution and the law and the criminal aspects of it, that your senior law officer is not committed to the central icon of your government's policy? That is, virtually unbelievable that that should happen. And if anybody provides me with a rational explanation for that anytime now in the future, yourself or someone else, I'll be very interested to hear it. A mistake of catastrophic proportions, but hopefully one that can be remedied if we look at where we are, decide what we're going to do, and agree as a national movement that we have to pursue a mandate in the next Scottish elections using the second vote as our target for obtaining a majority of votes, and then take that mandate from the people, mobilise internal and international pressure, and I'm perfectly happy to say how to do it, and face down Westminster in the belief that the power of the people is greater than the privilege of the Palace of Westminster.
Right. Thank you very much indeed, Alex Salmond.
Thank you very much, Lesley Riddoch.